I'm Sonya Campbell, 41 years old, and 3 months ago, something happened at my bank that changed everything. I was making a routine deposit of my quarterly bonus check when the teller looked at the amount, looked at me, then back at the check with this expression I knew all too well. But what the branch manager did next was even worse. If you've ever experienced racism in banking, retail, or any service industry, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this struggle. Growing up in Atlanta, my grandmother, Mama Rose, used to tell me stories about the first time she tried to open a bank account in 1965. Baby girl, she'd say, while braiding my hair on Sunday mornings after church, "They gonna test you every step of the way. But you show them your worth, not through anger, but through excellence, they can't deny." Those words shaped how I approached everything, from Howard University, where I earned my MBA in finance, to my first job at a predominantly white consulting firm, where I was often the only black face in strategy meetings. My path wasn't easy. During my early career at McKinsey & Company, I remember walking into conference rooms where conversations would stop, and I could feel eyes calculating whether I belonged there. There was this one partner, Margaret Chen, who became my mentor not because we looked alike, but because she recognized ambition when she saw it. "Sonya," she told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings, "your analysis on the healthcare merger was brilliant. Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are." Those words carried me through late nights preparing presentations that had to be twice as good, through client meetings where I had to prove my expertise before anyone would listen. My success at McKinsey led to opportunities I'd dreamed about since business school. After 5 years, I was recruited by Sterling Financial Group as their youngest senior vice president of strategic development. I specialized in community development financing, working with minority-owned businesses and underserved communities, work that felt like honoring my grandmother's legacy while building my own. I'd helped secure over $50 million in loans for Black and Brown entrepreneurs, created mentorship programs for young professionals of color, and earned recognition from the National Association of Black Accountants for my community impact work. By 2024, I was living what felt like the American dream I'd been promised if I worked hard enough. I owned a beautiful home in Buckhead, drove a BMW I'd bought with cash, and had an investment portfolio that would make my financial planning clients proud. My daughter Maya was thriving at Spelman, following in my footsteps with her own dreams of changing the world through business. I served on 3 nonprofit boards, was featured in Atlanta Business Chronicle's 40 Under 40 Inches, even though I was technically 42, and had built a reputation as someone who could navigate both corporate boardrooms and community organizing meetings with equal skill. The success felt especially sweet because I remembered being that little girl in Decatur who watched her mother clean houses for families who barely acknowledged her presence. I remembered my father working double shifts at the Postal Service while pursuing his accounting degree at night. I was living proof that the sacrifices of previous generations could bear fruit, that all those conversations about being twice as good could actually lead somewhere meaningful. Every milestone felt like honoring not just my own dreams, but the deferred dreams of everyone who came before me. But even in my success, there were subtle reminders that some spaces still saw me as an outsider first. The way security guards at upscale shops would follow me despite my designer clothes and expensive handbag. The way some colleagues would ask if I was the diversity hire when I joined new committees. The way restaurant hostesses would seat me near the kitchen even when I had reservations at prime tables. These incidents felt like paper cuts, small individually, but accumulating into a persistent ache that reminded me I was still fighting battles my white colleagues never had to consider. The morning of March 15th started like any other successful day. I just closed a major deal helping a Black-owned tech startup secure a $2.3 million expansion loan, and Sterling Financial had awarded me a performance bonus of $47,000. I remember feeling particularly proud because this was the kind of work that proved community development financing could be both profitable and impactful. I was on my way to Maya's campus for Parents' Weekend, planning to surprise her with some shopping money and maybe a nice dinner to celebrate her making Dean's List again. I pulled into the parking lot of the SunTrust branch on Peachtree Street, the same location where I'd been banking for 8 years. It was a beautiful spring morning, and I was wearing my favorite navy blazer, the one I'd bought to celebrate my promotion with pearls my grandmother had left me. I felt confident, successful, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The branch was busy but not chaotic, with the usual mix of business customers and individuals handling their banking. I'd been to this location dozens of times, though I usually used the ATM or mobile app for routine transactions. Today's deposit was larger than usual, but nothing that should have raised eyebrows for someone with my account history and professional standing. I had all my documentation ready, the bonus check from Sterling Financial with proper company letterhead, my account information, and my identification. Everything was in order, just like I'd been taught to keep my life. Walking through those glass doors, I never imagined I was about to experience the kind of racism I thought my success had shielded me from. My relationship with money and banking was shaped by generations of financial wisdom passed down through Sunday dinners and late-night conversations. Mama Rose had lived through an era when Black people were denied basic banking services, when saving money meant hiding cash in mattresses because banks wouldn't accept their deposits. My parents had been part of the first generation to access traditional banking, and they'd taught me to be meticulous about documentation, to always have receipts, to never give anyone a reason to question my legitimacy. Financial independence is freedom, Sonya, my father used to say, while balancing his checkbook at our kitchen table every Sunday night. But remember, they'll always question how you got it. He'd lived through the 1980s when Black professionals were routinely subjected to additional scrutiny, when success was met with suspicion rather than celebration. Even as a respected postal worker with an accounting degree, he'd faced assumptions about his capabilities and integrity that white colleagues never encountered. This wisdom shaped how I approached every financial transaction. I kept meticulous records, always had proper documentation, and conducted myself with the kind of professionalism that left no room for criticism. My investment strategy was conservative but effective, my credit score was excellent, and my banking relationships were built on years of consistent, responsible behavior. I understood that as a Black woman in finance, my reputation was both my greatest asset and my most vulnerable point. At Sterling Financial, I'd become something of an expert on community development and minority business financing, partly because it was meaningful work, but also because I understood firsthand the barriers that people of color faced in accessing capital. I'd seen how unconscious bias affected loan approvals, how cultural misunderstandings could derail business relationships, and how systemic inequities were often disguised as individual failings. My success came from being excellent at my job, but also from helping others navigate systems that weren't designed for their success. The morning I walked into that SunTrust branch, I was carrying more than just a check. I was carrying the hopes of every entrepreneur I'd helped secure funding, the pride of parents who'd sacrificed for my education, and the confidence of someone who'd earned their place in spaces that hadn't always welcomed people who looked like me. I was also carrying the weight of knowing that despite all my achievements, I was still vulnerable to the kind of treatment that had nothing to do with my qualifications and everything to do with the color of my skin. I approached the teller window with the same confidence I brought to client meetings. The young woman behind the counter, her name tag read Jennifer. You luck to be in her early 20s, blonde with the kind of practiced smile that suggested customer service training. I handed her my deposit slip and the check, along with my driver's license, just as I'd done countless times before. Good morning, I said pleasantly. I'd like to make a deposit to my checking account. Jennifer took the check, and her expression changed immediately. Her eyes widened as she looked at the amount. Then she glanced up at me with what I can only describe as disbelief. She held the check up to the light, examining it like she was inspecting currency for counterfeiting. The movement was deliberate enough that the customer behind me noticed, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. This is quite a large amount, Jennifer said, her voice carrying a tone I'd heard before, the kind of skepticism that had nothing to do with banking procedures and everything to do with assumptions about who deserved to have substantial money. It's my quarterly bonus from Sterling Financial Group, I replied, keeping my voice level. I can provide additional identification if needed. Jennifer continued examining the check, turning it over, holding it up again. I'm going to need to verify this with my supervisor, she announced, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. It's just we have to be careful with deposits this size. Especially when, she didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what she meant, especially when they come from people like me. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in institutional humiliation. Jennifer called over her supervisor, a middle-aged white man named David, who repeated the same theatrical examination of my check. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in my direction, while I stood at the counter feeling like I was on display. Other customers completed their transactions and left while I remained frozen in place, waiting for permission to deposit my own money into my own account. Ma'am, we're going to need additional verification for this deposit, David finally announced. Can you provide documentation of your employment at Sterling Financial Group? I pulled out my business cards, my employee ID, and my phone to show them my work email. David examined each item like he was conducting a forensic investigation. Meanwhile, I watched a white man in a wrinkled polo shirt deposit what looked like a similar amount, with nothing more than a casual greeting from the same teller who was treating me like a potential criminal. The thing is, Jennifer said, lowering her voice as if she was doing me a favor, we've had some issues with fraudulent checks lately, and when someone comes in with this kind of money, she gestured vaguely, but her meaning was clear. That's when I realized this wasn't about bank policy or fraud prevention. This was about a young white woman who couldn't reconcile my appearance with my financial success, and a supervisor who was more committed to supporting her assumptions than following proper procedures. I was being subjected to additional scrutiny, not because of anything I'd done, but because of who I was. The humiliation was compounded by the growing line of customers behind me, the whispered conversations, and the way Jennifer kept raising her voice when discussing verification procedures, as if she wanted everyone to know there was something questionable about my transaction. I felt the familiar fight-or-flight response that comes with recognizing racism in real time. The increased heart rate, the tightness in my chest, the calculation of whether to push back or comply to avoid making things worse. I've been banking here for 8 years, I said, trying to maintain my composure. My account history should show a pattern of professional deposits and responsible banking. Is there a specific policy that requires additional verification for bonus checks from established clients? David looked uncomfortable, clearly realizing that I was asking questions he couldn't answer without admitting the real reason for their scrutiny. We have to be careful, he repeated, the weakest possible justification for what felt like racial profiling. When I asked to speak with the branch manager, I was told he was in a meeting but would be available later. When I requested a written explanation of the verification procedures, suddenly there was no standard form for such requests. Every question I asked to understand their process was met with vague responses and bureaucratic deflection. It became clear that this wasn't about following policy, it was about making me uncomfortable enough to go away. After 35 minutes of what felt like an interrogation, Jennifer finally processed my deposit with all the enthusiasm of someone handling toxic waste. No apology was offered. No explanation was given for why the verification process took so long. I left the bank feeling shaken, humiliated, and angry in a way that I hadn't experienced since my early career days when such treatment was more common. The drive to Spelman was a blur of emotions. I called my mentor Margaret, then my mother, then my best friend Candace, trying to process what had just happened. Each conversation confirmed what I already knew: this was racism, plain and simple. The kind of subtle, deniable racism that banks could dismiss as procedure while making Black customers feel unwelcome and suspected. By the time I reached Maya's campus, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to let this slide. The next morning, I called SunTrust's customer service line to file a formal complaint. The representative, Angela, listened patiently as I described the previous day's experience. She was sympathetic, professional, and assured me that my concerns would be taken seriously. "We absolutely don't tolerate discrimination of any kind," Angela said. "I'm going to escalate this to our regional manager, and someone will contact you within 48 hours to discuss next steps." The call from regional manager Patricia Coleman came exactly 48 hours later, and it was everything I'd feared it would be. Patricia's tone was polite, but dismissive, her words carefully chosen to minimize what had happened while avoiding any admission of wrongdoing. "Ms. Campbell, I've reviewed the incident with our branch staff, and I want to assure you that our team was simply following standard verification procedures for large deposits," Patricia began. "Jennifer and David both maintain that they treated you with respect and professionalism throughout the process." "Standard procedures?" I interrupted. "Can you explain why those same procedures weren't applied to other customers making similar deposits that day?" There was a pause. "I'm not sure what you mean by that. I mean that I watched a white male customer deposit a similar amount with no additional verification, no supervisory consultation, and no examination of his check under fluorescent lighting," I said, my voice remaining steady, despite my growing frustration. "Well, every situation is different," Patricia replied smoothly. "Different types of checks, different account histories, different risk factors. I can assure you that race played no role in how you were treated." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Patricia systematically dismissing every concern I raised. When I mentioned the theatrical examination of my check, she called it standard fraud prevention. When I described the loud conversations about verification procedures, she suggested I might have misinterpreted the staff's tone. When I pointed out the different treatment of white customers, she claimed there were variables I wasn't aware of. "Ms. Campbell, I understand you may have felt uncomfortable, but I want to assure you that our investigation found no evidence of discriminatory treatment," Patricia concluded. "Our staff followed appropriate procedures, and we stand behind their professionalism." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I realized this wasn't Patricia's first conversation about racial discrimination. She had talking points, deflection strategies, and a systematic approach to denying racism while appearing reasonable and concerned. This was institutional protection at its finest, a carefully constructed wall of plausible deniability, designed to exhaust complainants and protect the bank from accountability. So you're saying that holding my check up to the light, calling supervisors for a routine deposit, and subjecting me to 35 minutes of verification while other customers were processed immediately was all standard procedure? I asked. I'm saying our investigation found that our staff acted appropriately given the circumstances, Patricia replied, her voice maintaining its professional tone while delivering a clear message. We're not admitting anything, and this conversation is over. When I hung up the phone, I sat in my office staring out the window at downtown Atlanta, feeling a familiar mixture of rage and exhaustion. This was how it always worked. Individual racism protected by institutional denial, obvious discrimination reframed as misunderstanding, and legitimate complaints dismissed through bureaucratic sleight of hand. But Patricia Coleman had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed I would accept her explanation and move on like countless other customers before me. She'd underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. I spent the next week documenting everything. I returned to the SunTrust branch during different times and days, observing how other customers were treated when making large deposits. I took notes on wait times, verification procedures, and staff interactions. What I discovered was exactly what I'd expected. White customers routinely made substantial deposits with minimal scrutiny, while Black customers faced additional questions and delays. More importantly, I started asking questions about SunTrust's policies and training. I requested copies of their official verification procedures, their anti-discrimination policies, and their staff training materials. When the bank claimed these documents were proprietary, I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for any communications between SunTrust and federal banking regulators about discrimination complaints. I also began reaching out to other Black professionals in Atlanta's banking community. Through my network at the National Association of Black Accountants and connections from my community development work, I started hearing similar stories. Dr. Dean Thompson, a successful surgeon, had been questioned when depositing insurance payments. Attorney Shanice Washington had faced additional scrutiny when opening a business account. Real estate developer James Mitchell had been asked for employment verification when making cash deposits from property sales. The pattern was clear, consistent, and well documented. SunTrust had a problem with racial bias in their customer service, and their management was committed to denying rather than addressing it. 3 weeks after my initial complaint, I received a letter from SunTrust's legal department. The letter was brief, formal, and infuriating. It restated the bank's position that no discrimination had occurred, reminded me of their commitment to serving all customers fairly, and included a $50 courtesy credit to my account for any inconvenience experienced. $50, as if the humiliation and discrimination I'd experienced was worth the equivalent of an overdraft fee. That letter was the moment I decided to fight back. The next morning, I called civil rights attorney Michelle Robinson, whose reputation for taking on institutional discrimination was legendary in Atlanta's legal community. Michelle had successfully sued several major corporations for racial bias, and her name alone was often enough to make companies reconsider their positions. Sonya, what you're describing is textbook disparate treatment, Michelle said after reviewing my documentation. The fact that they're denying obvious discrimination while offering you $50 tells me they're not taking this seriously. Are you prepared for a fight? I thought about Mama Rose, about my father's late-night lectures, about financial dignity, about Maya learning to navigate a world that would question her worthiness at every turn. I thought about all the other Black professionals who'd been subjected to similar treatment and quietly accepted it rather than rock the boat. I'm prepared, I said. Michelle's first move was to send SunTrust a formal demand letter outlining their discriminatory practices and requesting immediate policy changes, staff retraining, and monetary compensation for the civil rights violation. The letter was detailed, well-researched, and made clear that this wasn't going away quietly. SunTrust's response came 2 weeks later from their corporate legal team. They doubled down on their denial, claiming their investigation had been thorough and objective, and rejecting any suggestion that race had influenced my treatment. They also made it clear they had no intention of changing their policies or providing additional compensation. We stand behind our employees and our procedures, the letter stated. Ms. Campbell's allegations are without merit, and we will vigorously defend against any legal action. That's when things got interesting. Michelle filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against SunTrust, alleging violations of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Civil Rights Act. The lawsuit detailed not just my experience, but the pattern of discriminatory treatment toward Black customers that we'd documented. We also filed complaints with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, requesting federal investigations into SunTrust's practices. The lawsuit attracted immediate media attention. Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter Sharon Davis had been covering banking discrimination for years, and she recognized the broader significance of our case. Her initial article, "Banking While Black, Professional Woman Sues SunTrust Over Deposit Discrimination," sparked a conversation that went far beyond my individual experience. Within days, other SunTrust customers were coming forward with similar stories. The bank's social media accounts were flooded with complaints from Black customers who'd faced additional scrutiny, longer wait times, and presumptions of fraud when conducting routine banking business. What had started as one woman's discrimination complaint was becoming a public reckoning with institutional racism in banking. SunTrust's initial response was predictable. They claimed the lawsuit was frivolous, denied any pattern of discrimination, and suggested that their accusers were looking for quick payouts rather than legitimate justice. But as more customers came forward and media coverage intensified, their tone began to shift. The breakthrough came when Channel 2 Action News decided to conduct an undercover investigation. They sent Black and white customers with identical financial profiles to various SunTrust branches to make large deposits. The hidden camera footage was devastating. It showed Black customers routinely subjected to additional verification, longer wait times, and suspicious questioning, while white customers with identical transactions were processed quickly and courteously. The most damning footage came from the same Peachtree Street branch where I'd been discriminated against. The cameras captured Jennifer and David subjecting a Black business owner to the same theatrical check examination that I'd experienced, while a white customer making an even larger deposit was processed without question at the next window. When the investigation aired, SunTrust's corporate offices were flooded with calls demanding accountability. The footage was shared thousands of times on social media and #banking, while Black became a trending topic as people shared their own experiences with financial discrimination. But the real turning point came when federal banking regulators announced they were launching their own investigation into SunTrust's practices. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency sent a team to Atlanta to review the bank's policies, training materials, and complaint handling procedures. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau opened a formal enforcement action that could result in significant fines and mandated reforms. Suddenly, SunTrust was facing not just my individual lawsuit, but federal oversight, media scrutiny, and a public relations crisis that was affecting their stock price and customer retention. The $50 courtesy credit they'd offered was looking increasingly inadequate. The call came on a Thursday morning in June. Michelle's voice was calm, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath. "Sonya, SunTrust wants to settle. They're ready to have a serious conversation about resolving this." The settlement negotiations took place in the downtown offices of SunTrust's outside counsel, a prestigious firm that clearly recognized the seriousness of the situation. The bank's legal team included not just lawyers but senior executives who'd flown in from their corporate headquarters. Patricia Coleman, the regional manager who'd dismissed my initial complaint, was notably absent. "We want to resolve this matter in a way that addresses your concerns while allowing us to move forward," said SunTrust's lead attorney, a polished woman named Elizabeth Hartford. "We're prepared to offer a substantial settlement along with commitments to policy changes." The settlement offer was significant: $275,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, along with mandatory diversity training for all customer-facing staff, revised policies for handling large deposits, and the establishment of a customer advocacy position to handle discrimination complaints. Most importantly, SunTrust agreed to federal monitoring of their practices for 3 years to ensure compliance with civil rights laws. But Michelle wasn't finished. "My client also wants accountability for the individuals who discriminated against her and then participated in covering it up," she said. Jennifer and David's actions were clearly discriminatory, and Patricia Coleman's response was designed to protect the bank rather than address legitimate civil rights concerns. The negotiations continued for hours, but eventually SunTrust agreed to additional terms. Jennifer and David would receive mandatory sensitivity training and be transferred to positions without direct customer contact. Patricia Coleman would be removed from her regional management position. The bank would also fund a $100,000 scholarship program for underrepresented students pursuing careers in finance. As I sat in that conference room listening to SunTrust's attorneys acknowledge what they'd spent months denying, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and exhaustion. Justice was being served, but it had required months of fighting, legal fees, media attention, and emotional energy that no customer should have to expend just to be treated with basic dignity. The settlement was finalized in August, and the announcement made national news. SunTrust issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging failures in customer service while stopping short of admitting intentional discrimination. But the policy changes, financial penalties, and federal oversight sent a clear message to the banking industry about the consequences of racial bias. More importantly, the case established legal precedent that would make it easier for other customers to challenge similar discrimination. Michelle received calls from attorneys across the country who wanted to use our case as a model for their own banking discrimination lawsuits. The immediate aftermath of the settlement was overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from journalists, speaking invitations from civil rights organizations, and messages from people who'd experienced similar discrimination. I appeared on CNN, NPR, and several local news programs to discuss the case and its broader implications. But the response that meant the most came from my community. At New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, the Sunday after the settlement was announced, Pastor Campbell asked me to stand during service, while the congregation gave me a sustained standing ovation. Elderly members who remembered when Black people couldn't open bank accounts at all reached out to thank me for continuing the fight for dignity and respect. "You did what your grandmother would have done," my mother said during one of our regular phone calls. "You stood up not just for yourself, but for all of us." The institutional changes at SunTrust were implemented quickly and comprehensively. The bank hired Dr. Aisha Patel, a respected civil rights expert, as their new director of customer equity and inclusion. All customer-facing staff received 40 hours of mandatory training on unconscious bias, cultural competency, and fair lending practices. The bank's verification procedures were standardized and documented to prevent selective enforcement based on customer demographics. Most significantly, SunTrust established a customer advocacy office with a direct reporting line to senior management. Any customer who felt they'd been discriminated against could bypass branch-level management and have their complaint investigated by trained civil rights professionals. The office's quarterly reports to federal regulators would be public documents, creating transparency and accountability that hadn't existed before. The changes extended beyond SunTrust. Other major banks proactively reviewed their own policies and training programs, recognizing that the legal and reputational risks of discrimination were too significant to ignore. The American Bankers Association issued new guidelines for fair customer treatment, and several states passed legislation requiring financial institutions to report discrimination complaints to banking regulators. 3 months after the settlement, I received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer, the teller who'd initially discriminated against me. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell the conversation was difficult for her. "Miss Campbell, I wanted to call and apologize for how I treated you," she said. "The training we received made me realize that my actions were wrong, and I'm sorry for the way I made you feel." The apology felt genuine, and I appreciated that she'd taken the initiative to reach out. "I accept your apology, Jennifer," I said. "I hope this experience helps you treat all customers with the respect they deserve." It was a small moment, but it represented exactly the kind of individual change that could prevent future discrimination if it was happening across the industry. My role in fighting banking discrimination didn't end with the settlement. I was invited to serve on the Federal Reserve's Community Advisory Council, where I helped develop guidelines for fair lending practices. I spoke at conferences for banking professionals about recognizing and preventing racial bias. Most importantly, I became a resource for other people facing similar discrimination, helping them document their experiences and connect with legal resources. The scholarship program that SunTrust funded became particularly meaningful. Each year, 10 students from underrepresented communities received financial support to pursue careers in finance, along with mentorship opportunities and internships at reformed financial institutions. I served on the selection committee and was consistently impressed by the caliber of young people who were determined to change the industry from within. Maya, now in her senior year at Spelman, wrote her honors thesis on banking discrimination and civil rights enforcement. "Mom, you showed me that success isn't just about personal achievement," she said during one of our regular coffee dates. "It's about using your position to create opportunities for others." That comment reminded me of why the fight had been worth it. Individual justice was important, but systemic change was what would protect future generations from experiencing the humiliation and discrimination that I'd faced. A year after the settlement, I was invited to speak at the National Association of Black Accountants annual conference about my experience and its broader implications. As I stood before an audience of hundreds of Black finance professionals, I thought about all the conversations that had led to this moment, from Mama Rose's kitchen table wisdom to Maya's thesis research. Our success in predominantly white institutions is never just about our individual achievements. I told the audience, every time we excel, every time we demand respect, every time we refuse to accept discrimination as normal, we're creating space for the next generation to stand even taller. The audience response was electric. During the question and answer session, person after person stood up to share their own experiences with workplace discrimination, to ask for advice about fighting bias, and to thank me for refusing to stay quiet when I could have simply taken my settlement and moved on. One young woman, probably Maya's age, asked a question that stayed with me. Miss Campbell, how do you balance fighting for justice with protecting your own peace and mental health? It was a profound question that got to the heart of what every person facing discrimination must navigate. You have to remember that seeking justice isn't just about anger or revenge, I replied. It's about love, love for yourself, love for your community, and love for the people who will come after you. When you fight from a place of love, rather than hate, it sustains you through the difficult moments. The work continues every day. Through my role at Sterling Financial Group, I've been able to expand our community development programs and ensure that our own practices model the kind of equitable treatment that all institutions should provide. I've helped establish partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities to recruit diverse talent into the finance industry. Most importantly, I've created mentorship programs that prepare young professionals for the challenges they'll face while building the skills they need to create change. The legal precedent established by our case has been cited in dozens of subsequent discrimination lawsuits, and several have resulted in significant settlements and policy changes. Michelle Robinson's law firm now specializes in financial discrimination cases, and they've successfully challenged bias at banks, credit unions, and lending institutions across the country. But perhaps the most meaningful change has been cultural. Banking while Black is still challenging, but it's no longer a silent struggle. Customers are more aware of their rights, financial institutions are more conscious of their obligations, and there are systems in place to address discrimination when it occurs. The fight for racial equity in banking is far from over, but we've proven that individual courage combined with community support and legal expertise can create lasting change. Every person who refuses to accept discrimination as normal, every institution that commits to genuine reform, and every policy change that makes discrimination harder to hide brings us closer to the kind of financial justice that my grandmother could only dream about. When I think about the young woman who asked about balancing justice and peace, I want her to know that they aren't opposites, they're partners. True peace comes not from avoiding conflict, but from creating a world where dignity and respect are universal rights rather than privileges to be earned. That's the world we're building, one case at a time, one policy at a time, one generation at a time. Looking back on this experience, I recognize the complex emotions that come with fighting institutional racism. There's satisfaction in achieving justice, but also grief for the energy that discrimination stole from me and countless others. There's pride in creating change, but also sadness that such change was necessary in the first place. There's hope for the future, but also vigilance about the work that remains to be done. What I've learned is that resilience isn't about being strong enough to endure discrimination, it's about being courageous enough to transform it. Every Black professional who has ever walked into a bank, a boardroom, or any predominantly white space carries the legacy of those who fought before us and the responsibility to those who will come after us. We stand on the shoulders of civil rights pioneers who faced far worse circumstances with far fewer resources, and we owe it to them to continue the work of creating the America they envisioned. If you're watching this as someone who has experienced racial discrimination in banking or any other industry, know that your experience is valid, your anger is justified, and your fight matters. Document everything. Seek support from your community, and don't let institutions gaslight you into believing that obvious discrimination is normal procedure. There are resources available, legal protections in place, and a growing network of people committed to supporting your fight for justice. If you're watching this as someone who works in financial services or any customer-facing industry, I challenge you to examine your own unconscious biases and advocate for systematic changes within your organization. Real allies don't just avoid discriminating piglet, they actively work to create inclusive environments where discrimination can't flourish. And if you're watching this as a young person wondering whether success can really protect you from racism, I want you to know that while achievement doesn't eliminate discrimination, it does give you tools to fight it more effectively. Education, financial stability, professional networks, and legal knowledge are all forms of power that can be used to demand justice and create change. The story I've shared with you isn't just about one incident at one bank. It's about the ongoing struggle for dignity, respect, and equality in American institutions. It's about the power of refusing to accept discrimination as normal, the importance of community support in fighting injustice, and the possibility of creating lasting change when individual courage meets collective action. Subscribe to this channel if you want to continue conversations about racial justice, community empowerment, and the ongoing fight for equality. Share your own experiences in the comments, support others who are facing similar challenges, and remember that every story shared makes it harder for institutions to deny the reality of discrimination. Together, we're not just fighting individual cases of racism, we're building a future where no one has to experience the humiliation of being questioned, doubted, or diminished because of the color of their skin. That future is possible, but only if each of us commits to the work of creating it. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for being part of this journey toward justice. The fight continues, and we're stronger when we stand together.